This third and final provocation, you don't understand me, is slightly different because we have Rahul Tandon. He's the BBC East India correspondent, and he's going to explain the religion dimension when covering India. We report India as if it's just sometimes a new expanding economy. Isn't it fascinating? How much do we understand about Hindu nationalism? How dominant is that within the government? Rahul, over to you.
Roger, thank you very much indeed for that. I wrote a speech for this about understanding religion in India. Well, I tried to, but then I had to keep ripping it up because I think it is such a complicated and such a complex topic. In terms of a personal journey, reporting on India has been a personal journey for me. I was on a plane in 2007 to begin my job covering Eastern India and other parts of India for the BBC. And when I was on that journey, I remember turning to my wife and saying that one of the reasons, she's also of Indian origin, she's a journalist, she's standing in the background to correct any mistakes I make over the course of the next 10 or 11 minutes, saying that this was a journey for me to try and understand myself, a country that my parents had moved from to the UK in the late 1960s, and also to understand a religious dimension, because my parents, being British Hindus, when they moved to the country, a lot of their identity in the UK was shaped by that religious identity that they brought with them from India, the people they associated with, the temple that became a very central part of their lives. Some of the attitudes, unfortunately, they held towards other religions, particularly Muslims. It was interesting that when we arrived in India in 2007 into Kolkata, one of the great cities of Eastern India, one of the great cities of India, one of the great cities of Asia, that it was in the middle of the Durga Puja festival, or the main Hindu festival that's celebrated there. And that immediately began to bring some questions to me about covering religion in India, because I come from the north, my family come from the north of India. We would celebrate Diwali, didn't really know much about Durga Puja, even as a Hindu myself. My wife comes from the eastern part of the country. She's actually, her family are from Kolkata. It's a festival that's important to them. And it began to show me already the complexities that existed in India. Somebody once asked, me, what do you have in common with your wife? A very difficult question. I'm sure she'd say very, very little. And they said, coming from different parts of India, you speak different languages, you have different foods, but you seem to share this Hindu identity. But when I then pointed out that actually we worship different gods, we celebrate different festivals. So we may come under the broad term of Hinduism, but we're very different. And I think that's one of the complexities that people have to understand when you are reporting religion in India. We like to break it down in terms of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, but there are huge differences between a Muslim in Kashmir and a Muslim in Kerala. There are huge differences between the different Hindus. Even within the Christian churches, there are differences in the northeastern parts of the country, but from Christian communities that may be in Goa. So it is very complicated. But when Ruth put this question and asked me to speak about it, I think the first thing you have to understand is when you're covering India, and a young journalist called me just a couple of days ago and said they were thinking about going to India. They wanted to start working there. And what should they do in terms of preparation? And I said, look, when you go to India, one of the things that you will become, whether you like it or not, is a religious journalist, because it is integral to everything that you do. It is integral to just about every single story that you cover. If I look back at the stories that I've covered, whether it's the Gujarat riots, whether it's the Kumbh Mela, whether it's Ayodhya, whether it's the rise of Narendra Modi and what some would say is Hindu fundamentalism or Hindu nationalism in India, the Kashmir struggle. And I think if you want to understand India, and understanding India is an extremely complicated and difficult thing to do. I've been trying to do it for 15 years. Some days I wake up and feel that I knew less than when I started out here. You have to start with the creation of India. You have to go back to partition, 1947, because the reason I think why religion has to be central to whichever path India goes down, whether it's a secular path of the Congress Party or whether it's the path that the Narendra Modi government seems to be taking it down away from the path of the founding fathers of the Nehrus and the Gandhis and the Patels who set up India, is that when you have a country that to some extent has been created on the basis of religion, it's always going to play a key role in the way that it moves forward. I was just having a discussion with my father-in-law, whose family originally originated in Bangladesh and whose family moved over to India during part of that process. My own mother's family originate from Multan in Pakistan, and they moved to Delhi pre-partition as well. And so I think when you look at the scale of movement that took place in the partition of India, probably the greatest movement of migration that we've seen on this planet, maybe 1 to 2 million people dying in that process, particularly in the western part of the country. You have, I think, if you talk to many historians in South Asia at the moment, the defining moment that still is defining the identity of South Asia as a whole. Many times you'll see the Kashmir story beginning to crop up, India's only Muslim majority state, of course, some of it in Pakistan as well. So that moment is something that it seems very difficult for India to have been able to move on from. And so it is the central identity that exists there. And I think when we're looking to cover India, it's important to remember what happened in the 1940s, even though it may seem a long time ago, because it's still shaping the identity. I was having a conversation with a historian just a couple of days ago, and I was saying, look, you know, if you take a lot of young people in India now and Pakistan and Bangladesh, is partition still important to them? They're often the third generation away from it. They may live in parts of India which were not as badly affected as other parts of India, particularly the West. And they said, look, things are changing, obviously. But if you look at the rise of Hindu nationalism, I think a lot of people will attribute that to partition. You hear it in India. It's a conversation you hear all the time where people will say, look, when the British left, Pakistan was created, East and West, that was for the Muslims. India was created for the Hindus. Now, there will be many others who disagree with that, who feel that India should remain within its secular model. But I think the emergence during the late 1980s and the 1990s and of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, the Hindu nationalist government, and then the building of that by the Narendra Modi government can be attributed back to religion that exists there. I think another key thing that we have to look at when we're talking about covering India is, of course, look beyond just the Hindu and the Muslim identities that often dominate conversations. India has a very large Christian community, more than 30 million Christians in India. It's home to the largest Sikh community in the world, in the Punjab region as well. And it's fascinating to see how the whole issue of Sikh identity has risen to the fore again with the farmers' protest, because many of those farmers who are protesting come from the Sikh community in the Punjab state as well. And I think it's also, we have to be careful though sometimes, whilst understanding religion when covering India, to attribute everything to religion as well. There's been a lot of talk in the farmers' protests about it being a Sikh movement. There's no doubt there are a lot of Sikh farmers, but I think sometimes we can get confused when covering India, where we can put too much emphasis on religion and ignore other aspects of it. Just because people are from a particular religious group doesn't mean that the story that we're looking at should be a story in which we have to put in religious connotations to what's actually happening. I think what we're seeing in Punjab is a very economic story. And so sometimes the focus on the specific fact that many of the protesters are Sikhs really doesn't have that much to do with the story. And I think that is, again, one of the areas where we look at the complexity of what's taking place in India, and we can subscribe sometimes too much to what's taking place when it comes to religion. But in almost every story that I've covered, there is an aspect of religion to it that somehow you have to try and intertwine. Let me give you an example here of a story where you think has got nothing at all to do with religion at all when you're looking at India. One of India's biggest problems has been, people not using toilets, and people, basically men in particular, urinating on the roads. And I had to write a piece for Radio 4 from my own correspondent about it. And I remember writing it, and the thing that struck me about it the most was what was stopping people doing this. And my kids often said this to me: why do we see a lot of houses in India which have pictures of gods outside? And I said, well, the answer is very simple: because it stops men urinating, because religion is such an important factor in India that when they see those pictures on a house, whatever religion they're from, they're not going to do it. So, it's something that's just imbibed into everything that we do. We're talking here about the different faiths. We should also, one thing when you're covering India, we've talked, you can talk about the rise of Mr. Modi and Hindu nationalism. We've also seen over the last 20 years, the rise of caste politics in India's two largest states of Uttar Pradesh and also Bihar, with the rise of Mayawati there, with the rise of Lalu Prasad Yadav. So even when you're talking about specific religion, particularly the Hindu religion here, it's such a complicated political term, Hindu nationalism, because you've got one side of it with Mr. Modi, but then on the other hand, you've got the rise of the caste-based parties. You're seeing caste now, something that the Indian constitution outlaws. Discrimination on caste is something that should not be happening, but does happen on a daily basis of life in India. Pick up any newspaper, and one of the largest sections will be the marriage sections for arranged marriages. And when you read through that, what will you see? Complexion will be one of the first things what people talk about when looking for brides and bridegrooms. And the other thing that's always up there is caste as well. So you have to understand how the caste process works in India when you're looking to cover journalism there, or whether you're looking to cover stories there as well, because it has an economic, it has a social, and it has an extremely important political aspect when you're covering the world's largest democracy. So, I've just tried to give you a few examples there of the way that religion is intertwined with every single aspect of Indian life. There are a lot of stereotypes about India to do with spiritualism, etc. But the one thing that I found when I've been to just about every part of this amazing country, which I hope to return to soon after the pandemic is over, is wherever you go, you will find that faith has given people a very important part of people's lives. I want to end with something people often ask is, how come India's not had a revolution? How come when you have the majority of the world's poor, probably the biggest disparity in income that any country has in this planet, what is it that has stopped a huge revolution taking place in India? And I think when you're looking particularly on the Hindu side of stuff, this idea of karma, that your fate is pre-written because of what you've done previously, is something that to some extent has made some Indians accepting of their position in life, hoping that their next life is going to be even better. Have I learned a lot about India living there in many years? Yes, I've understood that faith is a central part of the way that this country has been born, exists, and will continue to function. Do I understand it? I'm trying. Still got a long way to go and many years ahead of me. But I think as we look forward to the world's largest democracy continuing to develop, if you want to understand it, you have to understand the role that faith is playing in it. There we go. I hope that was of some interest to you.